Rosie, it's up to you, however you want to handle it.
I'm happy for you all to just take a look at it on your own. And I'll walk you through it, but I don't know that we need to display it on
Okay.
the screen.
Okay. Well, thank you for being here and thank you for waiting. And we'll let you jump right in.
Sure. So for the record, Rosie Kruger, the State Director of Child Nutrition Programs at the Agency of Education. I just want to note that I do have a hard stop right before 2:30. I have to jump over to Houseways and Means. So hopefully we can get through all this today, but also happy to come back later and ask questions if we go over. You all have a draft bill, H-165, that would make the Universal Meals program that we've piloted this year or had going in Vermont this year permanent. And we wanted to provide some feedback to you all on changes that we would recommend making to that draft in the interest of making the bill implementable. It's your call as legislators in terms of how you want to spend these funds and how you want to do it and who should be included and all of that. But my interest is in making sure that whatever you tell me to do, I can actually do that. And so that's the kind of gist of the feedback today is focusing on those changes that we need you to make in order for us to actually be able to implement the bill. Walking through these, they're all kind of listed out here. One big recommendation is that throughout the bill, there are these references to the fact that the state is going to reimburse the cost of the paid student meals. And I understand what you all are asking us to do, which is to pay schools the supplement or the difference between the federal paid and the federal free reimbursement rate. And that's explicitly defined on page 7, line 3 of the bill. But when you go and take this language and insert it into state statute, I think these references to reimbursing the cost of the meals are going to be very confusing. And if someone wasn't reading carefully, they may think that the state was going to reimburse the actual cost of providing the meals rather than a set reimbursement rate. This year, the agency has been using the term universal meals supplement to refer to that difference between the free and paid federal reimbursement rates. And we would recommend making that a defined term in the legislation using that definition on page 7, line 3, and then everywhere that you've referred to the agency reimbursing the cost, instead say that the agency is going to pay out the universal meal supplement. And I think that will just make it all read a little bit clearer and not create any false expectation that if you spend $8 for a meal that we're going to reimburse you that whole $8.
Yeah, I think that makes good sense. And in the language, was this year's language, did it use cost?
Yeah. And I think last year's did too, but last year's was session law. And so
sorry,
when you take this and insert it into statute, I think it would be much cleaner to define that term and just refer to that.
Right. Hopefully nobody has tried to be reimbursed $8 for the cost. No. Okay, good. Any questions about that request? All right. We can go on then.
Yeah. So we had a number of recommendations around payment to independent schools. And this was the biggest area where we had originally asked you to make clarifications. If you decide to make this permanent, it was very clear last year that when an independent school is a standalone school food authority, you only wanted to provide funding for paid students who were attending on public tuition, but it was less clear to us how to handle those situations when independent school was a site under a public school food authority, which is a situation that happens. And I think we may have talked about that previously. And so this draft provides explicit guidance that in that situation, when an independent school is a site under a public school food authority, we should handle it the same way as an independent school that's a standalone SFA. So you don't want us to treat that independent school that is a site under the School Food Authority as if it's part of the public school Food Authority. You want us to treat it the way that we've treated standalone independent schools. But there are a couple of places where that's not super clear in the text. So the first is on page 5, line 12 to 13. There's basically a mismatch here in that, sorry, page 5, line 12 to 13. There's a reference to the fact that the independent school needs to make available both school breakfast and lunch to students attending on public tuition at no charge. And then later you say that in order to qualify, the independent school needs to participate in CEP or provision 2. And under those federal options, the SFA actually has to provide free meals to all of their students. So you couldn't say as an independent school, we're only providing free meals to our publicly tuitioned students. And then for our privately tuitioned students, we're going to charge them and do that and then still qualify to participate under these federal provisions. So I believe your intent is to require that an independent school offer free meals to all of their students in order to qualify for the funds. And if that's the case, we recommend striking that that extra language on page 5.
So the sort of the situation on the ground is the way that it's written. Well, maybe there's some lack of clarity here, so it's ambiguous, but the language that we wrote in last year for session law did not reimburse independent schools for the students who were not publicly funded?
Correct. And that seems to be the case here as well. So I'm understanding that the intent is that the legislature does not want to pay for paid student meals if that student is not attending on public tuition. So that's a call on your end to make. And if that's the decision that you're coming to, we just need you to clarify that a little bit further here.
So I'm just two thoughts. One is that I'm a little confused then whether if that is the intent and if we go that direction, will the federal government provide reimbursement or not for everyone else who
So if the independent school participates in CEP or provision 2, which you're requiring them to do later in the bill in order to get the funds, then they have to provide free meals to all of their students. They can't differentiate public tuition versus not. You as the state will be providing the funding for the paid students. The school will be drawing down the federal funding already for the free and reduced students, and then they'll be drawing down that small amount of federal funding for the paid students. They will need to identify another source of funds to cover the cost of those paid students that aren't covered by the state. Normally, that would probably be tuition. So they would set their tuition prices such that it would cover their costs. And that is likely an appropriate way of handling it. But if they were to instead try to charge those students for every meal that they ate, rather than offering all of the meals at no charge for an individual meal, that would not meet the federal requirements for provision 2 or CEP.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Other questions about this section? Representative O'Brien?
Connected, Rosie. How does Universal School Meals work with our interstate districts, with Dresden, Hanover, and Rivendell?
So for Rivendell, Vermont as a state agency has responsibility for oversight for all of the schools in that SFA, including Rivendell Academy, which is physically located in New Hampshire. So we treat them as if they were a Vermont school. They get all the funds for all of their students. We don't have them break out their New Hampshire students. The New Hampshire state agency does not involve themselves in that SFA at all for the school meals program. So they're not getting any federal reimbursement through the New Hampshire state agency. So we have ownership of that SFA completely.
New Hampshire elementary students going to Westshire in Vermont, do they get covered by this?
Mm-hmm. Yes, because it's a Vermont school and those are attending students at that school. So it doesn't matter where the student's home address is.
Okay.
And in fact, in those communities, you have kids who, if they have, if they're split custody, the kid may be living part of the time in New Hampshire and part of the time in Vermont. So it would be quite difficult to break that out.
And Hanover does not do it that way?
So Hanover, SAU, I don't remember what their number is. So in that case, New Hampshire has more of the responsibility for that supervisory union. That state administrative unit is the terminology in New Hampshire. We have Marion Cross is its own, Norwich School District is its own school district that operates Marion Cross School, which is located in Vermont. We have applied this requirement to Marion Cross. They were one of two schools in the state that were not previously offering any meals to their students. And so this year is the first time that they've been required to offer meals. They previously operated the special milk program through Vermont. And we provided them reimbursement just for milk served to students, but they did not offer meals. So this requirement hits Marion Cross, and we also provide the state funding to Marion Cross, but we are not providing any of the funding to Hanover High School or any of the New Hampshire elementary schools in that SAU because New Hampshire has responsibility for that SAU as a state agency.
Thank you.
And I don't think you need any changes here to the legislation to kind of codify that. That's how we've been operating. Certainly, you could check with Ledge Counsel, or we could speak more with the agency's legal counsel on that. But my understanding is that that's kind of longstanding practice in terms of how we've divided up those interstate school districts.
Okay, I think we're good here on that issue.
Okay, so on those same lines for independent schools, on page 5, line 19 and 20, you're talking about where the payments are going in the situation where the independent school is part of a public school food authority. And right now the language says that the state would pay the independent school, but in fact we would pay the public school food authority because they're the entity that we have the agreement with in order to provide meals at that site. And so we would be paying the public school food authority, and then the public school food authority would be turning around and requesting that the independent school provide any funding necessary for the non-publicly tuitioned students at that independent school site under that school food authority.
Good.
Let's see, on page 6, line 1 and 2, this section here is language that we requested to direct us on how to handle the situation when an independent school is participating in the community eligibility provision or in a subsequent year of provision 2. And you may recall that in those situations, we are not claiming based on the individual students who eat. So we can't actually track, was the student publicly tuitioned or not. Instead, we're claiming based on overall claiming percentages. So total number of students who eat, and then we apply these claiming percentages. So this language here is fine, describes what we've been doing, except that there's this phrase in line 1 and 2 of that page that says, if the approved independent school is its own school food authority and participates in CEP, we actually need this language to apply to all independent school situations, assuming that you want to handle those independent schools that are part of a public school food authority in the same way as other independent schools. So if you just strike that language there, then this section will apply to all independent schools. And we'll know what to do in that situation. I was a little unclear. You might need to rearrange the numbering in this section if you do that, and I think that would be a question for Ledge Counsel. But basically, all of these clauses in this section apply to all independent schools, with the exception of one here about who's getting reimbursed in the event that the independent school is part of a public school food authority.
Okay. Yeah, I think the intent is to treat those students at independent schools the same, whether or not their own food authority.
And yeah, again, that's your call to make, and I'm just providing you that clarification that we need there if that's the case. And then on page 8, lines 5 through 10 are just completely unnecessary. This is describing the fact that independent schools are allowed to offer free meals at no charge to all of their students, and that's already allowed under federal law, and so you don't need to allow them to do that. It mirrors language around public schools that I think is helpful, but you don't need to mirror that here because, again, they can already do that. You don't need to give them authority to do that.
Okay, good. We'll check with Ledge Council just to see whether there was some other reason that they might have wanted to or thought that was necessary, but that's good.
So moving on here, right now, one of the things that's working better about Vermont's law than the universal meals laws passed in the other states that have done it is that you gave the Agency of Education the authority to require that an independent school, that a school food authority receiving the universal meal supplement operate whichever federal provision draws down the most federal funding. Other states didn't do that. They gave their money without the strings attached that the schools had to do so in a way that draws down the most federal funds. And so those states are not maximizing the federal funds. So recommend keeping the language in here that does that, but then adding some additional language. And our suggested language here, which we're open to Ledge Council doing their magic on it, but is at the start of each school year, the Agency of Education may require that a school food authority requesting the universal meal supplement begin a new cycle of the relevant federal provision and groups sites in a manner that the agency determines will maximize the drawdown of federal funds. So we're not only requiring that they participate in CEP or Provision 2, but we're putting some requirements on the way that they participate. That if in fact we look at their direct certification numbers for this year and determine that if they start a new cycle, they'll be able to draw down more federal funds, or if they group schools in a different way, they'll be able to draw down more federal funds. We're requiring that they do that in order to get the universal meal supplement. And that is, doing that is a little bit more work on the part of the school food authority. So if you don't explicitly put this in there, we may run into a situation where some school food authorities say, well, I don't want to do that because it's going to be more work for us. And we're going to get the funds regardless. So this would be important to making sure that we maximize those state funds.
Questions about that? I guess the only question I would have is how much is a little more work that would be required, and whether the work would offset the administrative time and the expense would offset the federal funds.
So for CEP, they would need to submit to us, if they're starting a new cycle, they'd need to submit their backup documentation for the number of directly certified kids that they had identified. Most of that information is already on lists provided by the state. And in fact, when we do the direct cert Medicaid pilot, again, that will be coming from the state. So it's pretty simple to pull that information. If a school is starting a new base year of Provision 2 and they're getting a lot of applications, that's a situation where providing us all those applications can be somewhat time consuming. I don't think we would be, the only situation where we would be requiring folks to start a new base year of Provision 2 is this coming year, when we're going to suddenly have all this new direct certification through Medicaid information, and we want the schools to be able to take advantage of that. Again, that's direct certification information, so it's not applications. We're basically replacing applications with the direct cert information. So, I would say we're probably talking about a total of a day of work by an administrative in terms of providing the information to the agency by an administrative assistant for CEP. For Provision 2, if we required them to do a base year again, that is more work for sure. So that is having to count the students by status when they go through the line every day. and also having to do, attempt to collect applications from households. Again, we're not as worried about it because we're going to have that direct cert through Medicaid information, but they still have to make efforts. So that we'll be sending out that application to households, processing those applications as they come in. So that is definitely more work. My recommendation would be that this coming year you do require it because you are going to get better federal drawdown. In the future, after we have that one change, it's not going to give you better federal drawdown. So I don't see us requiring anybody to do that. And again, you're giving the agency the authority here to determine, is this a situation where we would be maximizing more federal funds? If so, that's when we would be asking them to do it.
And presumably the agency would look at the actual dollar amount of those federal funds and make a determination of whether it was worth the time and the expense of going through the process.
Yeah, I'm looking at this language and thinking that the language doesn't specifically tell the agency to do that. So that might be something that you'd want to, if that was a concern for the committee, you might want to work with Ledge Council on that language a little bit more. If it's going to be, if we look at it and it's going to be one additional student, I think, speaking for how I run the child nutrition programs right now, I agree with you that doesn't seem like a reasonable way of using folks' time. But you should keep in mind that you're putting this in statute for good, and so you don't want to put anything in there that assumes that people would handle things a certain way.
Right. Yeah. I think right now we're just all very aware of the challenges that districts are facing with staffing and handling all sorts of.
It's absolutely a valid concern. And I would say for CEP, we're really not talking about a lot of additional work. For Provision 2, that's where it could potentially be more work.
Okay. All right. Let's keep going then.
So the next section here is a big one. And the bill does not tell us what to do about childcares that have state-approved pre-Ks that are a part of a school food authority. So these childcares that have a state-approved or state-recognized pre-K, so these are pre-Ks that are eligible to receive the Universal Meals Supplement, to receive the Universal Pre-K funding. Those childcare centers, because they have a state-recognized pre-K in them, USDA regulations allow them to be a site underneath another school food authority. The way the regulations are written, these pre-Ks cannot be their own school food authority. So they have to be a site under another school food authority if they're going to participate in the school meals programs. Once they are participating because of that pre-K, they are then allowed and even really required to offer those meals to all of the children attending that child care center, because that pre-K childcare is now considered to be a site, and then you've got to provide meals to all of the kids at that site. So during COVID, a number of public school food authorities took on these pre-Ks because there was an ability to draw down federal funds to pay for all the meals served to children at those pre-Ks. And some of those relationships have continued on. And so this year we saw some of those same public school food authorities continue those sites, which they're, again, allowed to do. We interpreted that this year that those child cares with pre-Ks were part of sites they were sites under the public school food authority. So we gave them the Universal Meal Supplement for all of the paid meals served at those sites. I'm understanding that your intention is for us to not make that sort of assumption going forward, except that the way that you've defined independent schools, you're referring specifically to a piece of statute that defines independent schools and is not about these child cares with pre-Ks. And so they're just sort of left out of this completely and not mentioned. So it's really your call in terms of, do you want to treat them like an independent school? Do you want to treat them like a public school? You could say that public school food authorities are not allowed to have this type of site. I wouldn't recommend doing that because it's going to reduce access to the school meals programs for those sites. But it's really your call about how you want to handle it. But I'm flagging for you that right now there's a gap here where we're not sure what you'd like us to do in those situations.
And
Go ahead.
And the language is unclear.
It just leaves it out. You told us explicitly what to do about independent schools. You've told us specifically what to do about public schools, school food authorities, but you haven't told us what to do about these pre-K sites. And I'm honestly not sure if you passed out the bill as it is right now. I don't know what I should do with those sites. Should we provide reimbursement or not? I will point out that, you know, at those pre-K programs, most of those kids who are pre-K students are getting some public funding because they're getting the state universal pre-K funding. Then you have the younger kids that unless they're getting like a childcare subsidy, probably aren't getting public funding. So yeah, just need some direction from you on what you'd like to do in the situation.
Representative Cole.
I'm curious about how well the reimbursement with Universal School Meals would work with the CACFP program. And is it like double counting, or are they just?
Yeah, so they have to participate in one or the other. They're not allowed to double dip.
Okay.
And so one of the advantages of them being a site under the public school food authority is that they can kind of piggyback on all the paperwork, and they don't have to do their own paperwork in the CACFP. The CACFP is pretty burdensome, unfortunately, for paperwork. And so to the extent that we can bring all that paperwork into a food service director at the public school food authority who knows how to handle all of that, rather than putting that on the childcare director, that's been really a win. But you know,
I used to be the person doing that paperwork, and I can attest to that. It was a lot, and it took up a lot of my day. So
and it's generally for a small number of kids, so it's not really a super efficient use of time.
Representative O'Brien.
Rosie, how does it work with like PCCs? Do they negotiate to become part of an SFA? Or do they have to be on campus? Can they be off campus to be part of this?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not familiar with the term PCC. Is that private childcare or what?
I thought it was parent-child center.
Parent-child center, okay. So actually the parent-child centers, I think, are all considered to be state-approved education programs. And I listed this further down here in the recommendations. State-approved education programs are allowed by USDA to be their own school food authority. We currently don't have any of those programs participating in the National School Lunch Program. I think historically we have, but they're not participating at this point, I think probably for paperwork reasons. Some of them may be participating in the CACFP. I don't have all the CACFP programs in my head. But I guess they would have really either option there. And we would, if they were asking, we'd probably encourage them to try to be a part of another school food authority to reduce that paperwork burden. But right now we don't have anybody in that situation.
And is there any difference if you're on campus with these pre-K programs or not?
So as long as the location is allowed to be a site per USDA rules, which a parent-child center would be because it's got a state-approved program on it. And a childcare with a state-approved pre-K is allowed to be a site. So those are allowed to participate. If you just have a childcare that does not have a state-approved pre-K and does not have that state-approved education program designation, then their only option is to be part of the CACFP. They cannot participate in the school meals programs. And I will say that CACFP does not have the CEP or Provision 2 options in it. So in terms of if you're trying to draw down every last federal dollar, the school meals programs are probably slightly more advantageous for that reason, because once they're part of the school meals programs, they can potentially be part of a CEP grouping. All of the, if there are any Head Start students there, or children and families who are receiving 3 Squares Vermont or Reach Up, then those students count as being directly certified and can count towards that CEP multiplier.
Okay. So, and just to, before we move on to the next section, again, the language in last year's bill that's applied to this year's program, also, there wasn't language, but
Yeah, I think last year's bill was not quite as explicit about the definition of an independent school. I think it's referring to the definition. 166 is the number that's sticking in my head. And I think because you didn't have this specificity in last year's bill about what to do for some sites under a public school food authority, if those weren't specifically public schools, we made some assumptions that would, because the public school food authority was taking on responsibility for providing meals at these sites, we're just going to consider it part of that and provide funding, state reimbursement for all of the paid meals served to all of the sites there.
Okay. I know we're running out of time here, but when I'm thinking about the cost, what we know about the cost this year then is inclusive of several things that we might not have realized or might not have thought about last year, but now we need to think about them explicitly. And
right, by removing the paid students at that are not publicly tuitioned at independent schools that are part of a public school food authority, you're probably decreasing cost a little bit. If you were to add these pre-K programs in explicitly, right now I think we have maybe like 3 or 4 sites statewide, but I would imagine that if it was explicitly in there, more programs would begin to add those sites in the long term. So you might see a little bit of growth there.
yeah. Okay, do you want to stop there? I know you had to jump on
I
the
think
call.
we can go through these quite
Okay.
quick. There's just 3 more.
Let's go ahead.
So state-approved education programs, I mentioned that briefly already. We currently don't have any of these folks participating, but the part of statute that refers to the reduced price meals supplement does specifically call these locations out as eligible for that. And then this bill does not mention them at all. So you may want to throw those back in there as eligible, just in the event that in the future they did begin to participate. I heard some confusion in this committee about second breakfasts and whether that means if a child ate a meal at home, they're not eligible. That's not what we were meaning at all. So a second breakfast is something that's specifically mentioned in federal regulation. They don't say the term second breakfast, but in terms of in certain situations, if a school has extra meals left over, they are allowed to provide those meals to students as a second meal in addition to the meal that they've already received. And in some situations, they can claim them for federal reimbursement. In some situations, they can't. For clarity, the agency determined this year that we would not provide the universal meal supplement on any of those meals and asked you to tell us what you wanted us to do there. You excluded those, but given the reader's confusion, I think you may want to specifically reference the federal regulation where those are discussed. So it's very clear that we're not checking whether kids ate meals at home, because I can tell you that that's not something that we're interested in doing. It would be very impractical and not a recommendation.
Okay, good.
And then finally, there is an appropriation in the bill that's a one-time, for this upcoming year. This is the appropriation. We'd like some direction about what to do in the event that the appropriation is either not there in the future or does not cover the cost. For other programs, we might recommend that you tell us to prorate the funds, but because these funds are paid out monthly, we're not going to necessarily know, depending on what you've appropriated till the end of the year, that we're coming up short. So prorating is not necessarily a good situation. And then in the event that some future legislature does not appropriate any funding, we're making the recommendation that you kind of have a default in here that would repeal the requirement for schools to offer the universal meals, because otherwise you're going to be in an unfunded mandate situation where you've required it without funding.
Yeah,
So-
this is it's something that we've been talking about with, over the weekend, that I've been talking about with JFO and with Ledge Council, and we wanted, I think the intent is to treat this like any other categorical aid program. So rather than necessarily have a dollar figure here for the coming year, we're going to look at how should we approach that. But thank you for flagging it too.
Yeah. So those were all of the comments that we had in terms of technical changes.
Great. Well, unless there are any final questions, thank you very much, Rosie, and I'm sure we'll be back in touch to just make sure we got everything nailed down, and we'll let you go.
Great. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And committee, we have I think I see our next witness here, but why don't we take a couple minutes to stretch? I know that clock is a little fast.